They thought he was just another palace guard, silent, rigid, ceremonial, the kind you take selfies with and walk past without a second thought. So when a group of American officers started mocking him in front of a crowd, nobody expected him to react, and he didn't. But then their captain pointed at the strange emblem on his wrist, and when a British colonel overheard and stepped in to take a closer look, everything changed. Because that patch wasn't just a decoration, it was a ghost from a mission no one was supposed to remember. Now, before we reveal the story behind it, press that subscribe button and comment below where in the world you're watching from. Let's begin. The London morning felt like breathing through wet wool, that fine mist that doesn't quite qualify as rain but soaks through everything anyway, turning the palace courtyard into a sheet of polished gray stone. The kind of weather that makes tourists huddle under umbrellas and guards grateful for thick red wool. Buckingham Palace loomed behind the gates like it always did, massive, unmoved, permanent. The kind of place that had watched empires rise and fall while remaining exactly where it stood. Black iron railings stretched in perfect lines, polished by decades of London rain and the touch of countless hands. Each spear point gleamed despite the overcast sky, and the ornate gilt work caught stray beams of light that managed to pierce the cloud cover. The palace itself seemed to breathe with quiet authority. Windows reflected the gray morning back at itself, hiding whatever ceremonies or preparations might be taking place within those walls. The royal standard hung limp in the still air, its colors muted by mist but still commanding respect from every passerby. Beyond the gates, the pale stone facade caught what little light filtered through the clouds, each carved detail telling stories of centuries past. Somewhere in the distance, the measured sound of boots on gravel announced another patrol beginning, its rounds the rhythm as predictable as clockwork, but somehow never quite routine. The very stones seemed to echo with the footsteps of thousands who had walked these same paths, carrying the weight of duty and tradition that stretched back through generations of service. Staff Sergeant Hugh Mercer stood exactly where he'd stood yesterday, and the day before that, 2 paces from the black iron gate, rifle at present arms, chin level with the horizon. His red tunic was pressed sharp despite the dampness, brass buttons catching what little light filtered through the clouds. The tall black burskin sat perfectly centered, as unmovable as the man beneath it. He was older than most ceremonial guards, mid-40s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun that was hotter and more dangerous than anything London offered. A thin scar crossed his left jaw, pale against weathered skin, the kind of mark that came from metal moving too fast in places that didn't appear on tourist maps. But his face gave nothing away. That was the point. The tourists had started gathering early today. School groups with matching raincoats, families with cameras that cost more than most people's cars, retirees checking items off bucket lists they'd been planning for decades. They pointed and whispered the way people do at museums, half expecting the exhibit to suddenly move or speak. A few children waved at him with the innocent persistence of youth. Others tried jumping to catch his attention, their parents pulling them back with hushed warnings about proper behavior. Mercer never moved, only his eyes shifted, tracking everything, missing nothing, the way a man learns to watch when his life has depended on noticing what doesn't belong. From the far side of the courtyard came different sounds, military boots on wet stone, moving with purpose rather than sightseeing shuffle. American voices, confident and loud, cutting through the morning quiet like engines through fog. The kind of voices that expected to be heard and never doubted they deserved attention. 5 officers approached the gate area, walking with the particular swagger that comes with being off duty in a foreign country. Dress uniforms crisp despite the dampness, caps tilted at regulation angles, ribbons neat and colorful in precise rows. They moved like tourists but talked like soldiers. The difference was in their posture, straight backs, measured steps, eyes that automatically scanned for exits and threats even while relaxed. They were the kind of group you saw at embassy receptions and joint training exercises. Professional military, but comfortable with their status as visiting allies. The type who expected doors to open and protocols to bend slightly in their favor, not arrogant exactly, but accustomed to being welcomed, accommodated, treated with the respect due to representatives of America's military might. Captain Ryan Kessler led the group with the natural authority of someone who'd never questioned his right to be in charge. Late 30s, built like he still hit the gym twice a day and bench pressed his problems into submission. Voice that carried without trying, the kind that had been giving orders since college or OTC and expected them to be followed without question. He had the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered, whose career had moved along predictable tracks of promotion and recognition. Behind him, the others fell into the familiar rhythm of junior officers following a senior. They shared the particular camaraderie of men who'd served together, who knew each other's stories and trusted each other's judgment, the kind of bond that forms in training environments and deployment rotations where competence matters more than personality, and everyone learns to play their role in the larger machine. "Look at this guy," he said, gesturing toward Mercer as they got close. "Man's been standing there so long I think moss is starting to grow." Laughter from his group, easy, comfortable laughter from men who felt safe making jokes in foreign countries, protected by rank and diplomatic immunity. "Do they ever actually do anything?" asked one of the others, a younger officer with lieutenants. "Bars that still look too bright, too new. Or is it just stand there and look intimidating for the cameras?" "Come on," said the tall Marine beside him, a staff sergeant by his stripes, but clearly comfortable joking with officers. "It's tradition. Got to respect the pageantry. Not like he's actual combat arms or anything. Probably never held a real rifle in his life." More laughter, louder now, the kind that draws attention and makes bystanders uncomfortable without quite crossing into territory where someone might object. Mercer didn't react, didn't blink, but something shifted in his jaw just barely, the kind of movement only another soldier might catch, like a muscle memory from times when staying still meant staying alive. The rain tapped against the cobblestones like distant applause, and somewhere beyond the gates came the sound of horses from the next patrol, their hooves echoing off stone walls that had heard the same sounds for centuries. But for now, Mercer stood alone, unmoving, waiting with the patience that only comes from experience with much worse situations. The Americans didn't just walk past, they lingered. Kessler stepped closer to the rope line, not quite crossing it, but getting near enough to make his point clear. His group gathered behind him, feeding off his confidence the way officers do when they're off duty and feeling bold, when the usual chains of command feel looser and more forgiving. "Gentlemen," he announced, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear, "observe peak military endurance, hours of standing, zero movement, God-tier discipline." The tourists were watching now, phones coming out like weapons being drawn, sensing something was about to happen that might be worth recording. A few British onlookers shifted uncomfortably, but nobody said anything. This was their country, their tradition, but these were visiting allies' diplomatic waters carefully navigated. "I have seen department store mannequins with more combat experience," said the young Marine, grinning at his own joke and looking around for approval from his superiors. "Careful," Kessler replied with mock seriousness, playing to his audience. "He might snap and bayonet somebody. Those are real rifles, right? Or just props?" That got bigger laughs, the kind that made bystanders look around nervously, wondering if they should stay or move along, unsure whether this was appropriate entertainment or something more problematic. A middle-aged British woman near the rope whispered to her husband, "They shouldn't be doing this." But she didn't speak up. Nobody did. Kessler turned back to Mercer and gave an exaggerated American salute, all theatrical precision and zero respect, like he was saluting a statue in a park rather than a serving soldier. "Permission to engage in ceremonial warfare, Sergeant." Silence. Mercer's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, expression unchanging. The damp on his face hadn't moved in 10 minutes, and his breathing remained steady, controlled, invisible, stone cold. Kessler chuckled. "Bet this guy hasn't cracked a smile since the Falklands. Do they train you guys not to blink? Or is that just natural British charm?" He was performing now, playing to his audience. Some of the tourists laughed along, awkwardly, unsure whether this was appropriate, but not wanting to seem uptight. But the British spectators stayed quiet, their shoulders getting tighter, their expressions more guarded. That's when Kessler noticed something. The rain had darkened patches of Mercer's uniform, and beneath the cuff of his left glove, something showed, just an edge, black and tan fabric, barely visible where the sleeve met his wrist. Old fabric, worn, faded by sun and time and washing. Kessler squinted, leaned forward slightly, like he'd spotted something interesting in a shop window. "What's that? Some kind of secret patch or just decoration?" he pointed, drawing his group's attention and making sure the cameras caught it. "Boys, check this out. Our friend here has got himself some tactical embroidery." Another round of laughter, less restrained now. Even the youngest officer, clearly uncomfortable but not wanting to stand out, laughed nervously rather than risk seeming like he couldn't take a joke. Probably says Queen's own ninja battalion, said one of them. Or specialty service, added another, getting a bigger laugh. Maybe licensed to drill, threw in the Marine, warming to the theme. Someone behind them pulled out a phone and zoomed in, trying to get a clear look. Looks like a triangle with numbers or something, can't make it out clearly. Kessler leaned closer, studying the barely visible patch like it was evidence in a case he was building. His voice dropped just enough to seem conspiratorial. You know what I think? I think somebody's been shopping at the Army surplus store trying to look more interesting than he really is. Mercer remained perfectly still, but his eyes, those steel blue eyes that had seen things these officers had only read about in reports, flicked once toward Kessler's shoulder, noting the rank, measuring the threat, calculating response options, then returning to the horizon without change. You know what I really think, Kessler said, dropping his voice just enough that the cameras wouldn't catch it clearly. I think somebody signed up for the uniform, not the service. Hiding behind parade ground drills while the rest of us did the real work. No response. Not even a twitch. But something in the air changed, like pressure dropping before a storm. I mean, really, Kessler continued, warming to his theme and drawing energy from his audience. Do these guys even train with actual weapons? Or are they just for polishing and looking pretty for the tourists? Before anyone could answer, he took one final step forward, not quite crossing the line, but close enough to be clearly disrespectful, close enough to provoke, close enough that his shadow fell across Mercer's boots. He raised his hand slowly, mockingly, moving it toward Mercer's face, hovering just short of the brim of the bearskin hat. What happens if I just, Captain? The word cut across the courtyard like a blade through silk. Every head turned, every conversation stopped, even the rain seemed to pause. The voice came from the rope line's edge, sharp, unmistakably British, carrying the kind of authority that made smart people stop talking immediately, and dumb people wish they had. A man in a service cap was already moving toward them, his darker uniform marking him as something more than the usual palace security. Eagle insignia on his shoulders caught the weak sunlight, boots striking the wet stone with purpose, each step measured and deliberate. Kessler blinked, trying to assess how much trouble he'd just created for himself and whether his diplomatic status would cover it. The officer closed the distance, fast but not rushed, controlled, professional. The way someone moves when they're used to situations that require both speed and precision. Captain, he repeated, voice carrying across the suddenly silent courtyard. Step away from that post, now. Then his eyes weren't on Kessler anymore. They were fixed on the hidden patch beneath Mercer's glove, and his expression was changing, in ways that made the air feel heavier, more dangerous. Colonel David Wethbone wasn't someone you needed to be introduced to. His presence announced itself before he spoke, the way other soldiers straightened without being told. The way conversations died when he approached. The way even visiting officers instinctively deferred to something they couldn't quite identify, but definitely recognized. He was mid-50s, silver threading through short hair that had probably been regulation perfect for 3 decades, broad shoulders that had carried weight others couldn't handle, with the kind of build that spoke of years in the field rather than behind a desk. His uniform was perfectly maintained, but showed wear in places that mattered, the kind of details that separated desk officers from field commanders. He didn't acknowledge the Americans, didn't offer diplomatic pleasantries or protocol courtesies. His focus was entirely on the man at post, studying him with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that mattered. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried perfectly in the sudden silence. Where did you earn that patch? Just long enough for wind to catch the Union Jack overhead and snap it once against its pole, the fabric cracking like a whip in the thick air. Mercer didn't look at him directly, just shifted his gaze down enough to register who was speaking. The kind of minimal acknowledgement that stayed within regulations while showing respect. Then he answered in the same level tone he might use for time and temperature. Bastion. Operation Redway. Forward Recon 3. The effect was immediate. Wethbone's posture didn't change, but his eyes widened fractionally, his lips pressed together. Something passed across his face, recognition, memory, maybe pain. The kind of expression that comes when ghosts suddenly become real. He stepped back and turned to face the Americans. Captain Kessler, he said, his voice now carrying to the entire crowd, clear and authoritative. Your NATO delegation? Kessler nodded once, uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time that morning. Unofficial visit. Sightseeing before the conference starts. Wethbone's tone didn't rise, but something in it sharpened like a blade being slowly drawn from its sheath. You've just publicly mocked a soldier from one of our highest clearance reconnaissance detachments, a unit whose existence isn't acknowledged in official records, a man whose service record predates your commission by 15 years. The silence stretched like a wire under tension. Even the rain seemed to pause. Tourists lowered their phones, instinctively sensing they were witnessing something more serious than entertainment. Captain Kessler went pale beneath his tan. "Sir, I wasn't aware." "No." Wethbone cut him off, the word sharp enough to draw blood. "You weren't, because you assumed instead of asking. Because you saw ceremony and decided it meant weakness." He gestured once toward Mercer's gloved wrist, the movement precise and economical. "That emblem isn't decoration, Captain. It's not costume jewelry from a surplus store. It's the field insignia of Forward Recon 3, part of British Joint Special Operations Command under ISAF, officially disbanded in 2009 after Operation Redway, a mission buried under NATO classification levels you don't have clearance to know about." The crowd had gone completely still, phones lowered. Even the children stopped fidgeting, sensing something important was happening that they didn't understand but should respect. That unit held defensive positions outside Bastion Airfield for 37 minutes against coordinated insurgent assault. They bought evacuation time for 3 NATO convoys carrying wounded, including personnel from your own 4th Battalion. Captain Wethbone's voice remained calm, factual, devastating. In its precision, 6 men went in, 2 came out. One was medically retired and never returned to service. His eyes returned to Mercer, something like reverence creeping into his expression. "The other is standing in front of you, still serving, still silent, still holding the line." Nobody moved. Tourist cameras stayed down. The mockery had evaporated, completely replaced by something heavier, more serious, more real than anything that had happened in this courtyard in months. Kessler opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse, no diplomatic phrase that could undo what had already been said. And Mercer hadn't moved, still hadn't blinked, but the air around him had changed completely. He wasn't a statue anymore, he was a monument. Wethbone let the silence work for several heartbeats before continuing, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "That patch," he said, looking directly at the Americans, "was issued in a forward staging area, hours before a mission that wasn't supposed to exist, not officially. Their orders were hand-delivered by officers who didn't give their names. Their extraction plans changed hourly. Most operations they ran don't appear in any medal citations, because those missions weren't meant to be remembered, just completed." One of the younger American officers shifted uncomfortably. The Marine who'd been making jokes earlier had gone completely still, his face pale under his tan. Wethbone turned back to Kessler, his attention focused like a laser. "You asked what he does. Let me tell you." He paused briefly, organizing thoughts that clearly came from personal knowledge rather than briefing papers. March 4, 2009. A section of Route Redway collapsed under coordinated fire and staged IED attacks. Taliban forces overran 2 checkpoints, aiming to breach Bastion's western perimeter before air support could respond. 3 medical convoys were inbound from Sangin to American, 1 British carrying wounded from the previous day's contact. The colonel's voice remained steady, professional, like he was briefing a staff meeting, but one where lives hung in the balance. Mercer's unit wasn't supposed to be unseen. They were en route to staging when the call came through. 6 men held the fallback corridor against insurgents with RPGs and small arms. 43 minutes of sustained contact, no armor support, no air cover, no backup coming. He glanced at the crowd, then back to the Americans, making sure everyone understood the scope of what he was describing. 5 of those men died in a collapsed bunker, covering a wounded U.S. combat medic whose convoy had taken a direct hit. Their radios were destroyed, position unmarked on any map. Mercer was the only one standing when the quick reaction force finally reached the position. The weight of it settled over the courtyard like fog rolling in from the Thames. His reward was 3 surgeries, 6 months of silence while the mission was classified beyond recognition, and reassignment to a posting that doesn't appear on public records. Wethbone looked directly at Kessler now, his eyes holding the captain's gaze without mercy. "So no, Captain, he's not here for pageantry. He's not entertainment for tourists. He's here because when offered medical retirement with full honors, he said no. He asked to serve again quietly right here." Kessler swallowed hard, his throat working like he was choking on words he couldn't say. "I didn't know. You didn't ask." It wasn't said harshly, just stated as fact, delivered with the finality of a door closing. but it landed with enough force to make everyone within earshot flinch. Near the front of the crowd, a young boy slowly raised his hand in a careful salute toward Mercer. His father started to pull the hand down, then stopped, understanding something had changed here, something that deserved respect rather than correction. The gesture held small and perfect in the gray morning air. Mercer couldn't respond, not while on post, not without breaking regulations that had governed his life for decades. But he saw it, registered it, filed it away with all the other moments that made service worthwhile. Behind him, his relief guard shifted stance by half, an inch, recognition passing between professionals, respect moving through the ranks without words or ceremony. Kessler stepped forward, not boldly this time, but carefully, like a man approaching something fragile and dangerous. "I'd like to apologize, Sergeant." Mercer didn't acknowledge it, couldn't, by regulation, by training, and by the simple fact that some apologies weren't his to accept. Wethbone spoke instead, his voice gentler now, but still carrying authority. "Apologies aren't for him to accept, Captain. He's heard worse, seen worse, didn't break then, either." Then the colonel stepped closer to Mercer, speaking quietly but clearly enough to carry across the silent courtyard. "You saved lives that day, including some of mine. My medics made it out because you held the line when everything else fell apart." A brief pause, heavy with memory. "You never asked for recognition, never wore it on your sleeve for people to see." Wethbone glanced at the nearly invisible patch worn almost to nothing by time and weather and washing. "But you never took it off either." He straightened to full attention, his movements precise and deliberate, and no one here would question it again. Without fanfare, without announcement, Colonel Wethbone brought his hand to his temple and delivered a full formal salute right there in the courtyard, in front of tourists and cameras and visiting officers. A colonel saluting a ceremonial guard. The gesture cut through protocol, through rank, through everything that normally mattered in military hierarchy. The tourists went completely silent. Even the Americans who'd been mocking Mercer now stood at something approaching attention, instinctively recognizing the gravity of what they were witnessing. Mercer couldn't return it, not while on post, not without abandoning everything he'd been trained to do. But something shifted in his expression, not a smile, something quieter, deeper. Recognition received, not demanded. Wethbone held the salute longer than regulation required, making sure everyone understood what they were seeing, then dropped it with precision that would have made a drill sergeant weep. A palisade appeared beside the American group, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been watching from a distance and understood what needed to happen next. This time, there was no humor in his voice, just quiet authority. "Gentlemen, if you'll follow me back to your transport." Kessler nodded stiffly, his swagger completely deflated, of course, as they moved past the rope line. One of the younger officers, the lieutenant who'd looked uncomfortable throughout the entire encounter, slowed his steps. He turned back briefly and gave Mercer a single nod. Not for show, not for cameras, just recognition between soldiers. Acknowledgement of something that transcended nationality and rank and all the stupid things that usually divided military personnel. Mercer saw it, but didn't respond, couldn't. But he registered it, filed it away with the other moments that reminded him why he still put on the uniform each morning. The courtyard slowly returned to normal, a new guard rotation forming in the distance, their boots echoing off stone in the familiar rhythm of ceremony and tradition. Tourists beginning to speak again, voices hushed and respectful. Phones remained lowered, as if recording what they'd just witnessed would somehow diminish it. The boy who'd saluted earlier tugged on his father's coat. "Dad, was that man a hero?" His father looked at Mercer, still unmoving, still silent, still perfect in his stillness, and considered the question with the care it deserved. "I think he still is," the man said quietly. No applause followed, no ceremony. Just the quiet understanding that something important had happened, something that wouldn't be in tomorrow's guidebooks or tourist brochures, but would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. And at the center of it all, Mercer remained at his post, a man with nothing left to prove to anyone, holding the line because that's what he'd always done. When the changing of the guard began 20 minutes later, it proceeded with its usual precision. Commands issued in voices that carried centuries of tradition. Rifles exchanged with movements perfected by countless repetitions. Positions rotated with clockwork timing that spoke of discipline earned through years of practice. When Mercer's relief arrived, he fell out wordlessly, rifle coming to his shoulder with the same fluid motion he'd performed thousands of times. His posture didn't waver, not even in motion. not even as he transitioned from stillness to movement. He marched toward the arch that led back to Wellington Barracks, away from the gates and the rain, and the tourists who would never fully understand what they'd witnessed. Inside the barracks, the fluorescent lights hummed against tile floors that had seen the boots of generations of guards. The contrast was sharp drab walls painted institutional green, wet boots lined up by heating vents, the smell of wool and metal polish, and strong tea brewing in a corner kettle. A different world from the grandeur outside, but somehow more honest. He stepped into the changing area with the same methodical care he brought to everything. Other guards, mostly younger men who'd heard whispers about his past but never asked questions, moved around him quietly. Some nodded respectfully. None spoke. None needed to. As he removed his gloves with practiced ease, a young corporal near the assignment board pulled down a transfer request that had been posted for weeks. He glanced at it once, reading the familiar words, then tucked it beneath other papers without ceremony. The request was denied anyway, had been from the start. Some men were too valuable to let go even when they asked. Mercer folded his red tunic with precise creases that would survive until the next wearing, hung up the burskin with care that bordered on reverence. From inside his duty belt, wrapped in protective cloth, he carefully extracted the patch-faded triangle with stylized numbers, 03RF, Forward Recon 3. He held it for a moment, feeling the worn fabric between his fingers, remembering faces that would never age past their last mission. Then he placed it in a small metal tin beside a photograph that went everywhere with him. 5 men in desert fatigues, arms around each other, grinning under Afghan sun. No names written on the back. None needed. He closed the tin with a soft click, slid it back into his kit, and headed for the corridor. No drama, no ceremony, just quiet purpose, the same as always. Outside, the sky was clearing. The mist had lifted, revealing patches of blue that promised a better afternoon. Tourists still moved around the palace gates, some still talking quietly about what they'd witnessed, others never understanding what had happened, carrying on with their planned itineraries and photo opportunities. Mercer didn't look back as he walked down the hall toward whatever came next. There was nothing more to say. Have you ever watched someone get judged before anyone bothered to ask their story? Do you think quiet service deserves the same respect as public recognition? Let us know in the comments below. If this moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss these stories. And if you know someone who thinks these guards are just for show, share this with them. It might change how they see things. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one, and we'll see you in the next one, and we'll see you in the next one, and we'll see you in the next one.